Okay. That's all. We'll pick up right back here. Both classes ended about the same spot. So we will pick up here. I'm on page 3 in your PowerPoint. So when you guys, if you will, go ahead and turn to page 306 in your book so we can get finished with this section. So anatomy of the respiratory system, we'll continue with that. Okay, the bronchi. So we talked about, went all the way through to the trachea. And let me see if I can get, go back to the other picture. Here you go. So you can see the trachea here. And then once the trachea gets to the lungs, it actually splits into the bronchi. Now, bronchi is plural. So you'll hear the word bronchus used, and that's singular. Okay, so that's singular for just that one larger tube. This splitting into two is actually called a bifurcation. So in case you ever hear that word, bifurcation is just that splitting into. Okay, so the bronchi are split into right and left. And look at the difference. So look at page 306. You can actually see the difference in the sizes. So on the right side, we see that it's a little bit, it kind of doesn't really look that way here, but it is wider and it's shorter. Okay, you can kind of see that first, it's much shorter because it splits out a little bit earlier. So the right side is wider and shorter, but look, it's also more vertical. See how it kind of goes down further? And so one of the things that we see with that is that it's a lot easier for things to get lodged in the right side. So a lot of times if that's a concern, if there's a concern that some kind of foreign something has gotten lodged into, like down their windpipe or down their trachea, a lot of times they'll look in the right side first because that's usually where it happens. It's straighter, it's wider, and so it's kind of the path of least resistance. Now, look at the shape of these one more time. You'll notice something, and we'll talk about this more in detail in a minute, but the right side, the right lung actually has 3 lobes, and the left lung has 2. So that's part of what causes the difference in the shape of the bronchi. Okay, bronchioles, from the primary bronchi, so from the primary, the right and left bronchi splits up, and then those branches actually get smaller and smaller and smaller. So notice in the picture, then you have secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, so it gets smaller and smaller. Then you have bronchioles, and bronchioles are very tiny little tubes that air travels through. So I'm getting everything here. Okay, the alveoli, actually, let me see. Oh, here's what I was going for. Look on page 307, okay, and you can see it actually talks about the conducting zone and the respiratory zone under where it says alveoli. Okay, the conducting zone are your bronchioles and then the bronchial branches. So think of conducting. So that's when things are able to move or move across something. So conducting zones, that's where air just travels, not where it gets exchanged. Okay, versus the respiratory zone of the lungs that we hear, these are the respiratory bronchioles and then the alveoli and the alveolar ducts. These are areas where gas exchange actually takes place. And they just get smaller and smaller and smaller as you go. Make sure I cover everything before I move on. Okay, let's look at alveoli. Alveoli is something that you've heard before. We've talked about it before. It may have been a while. Alveoli is plural. Alveolus is just one. And what this is it's like looks like a cluster of grapes. Okay, it's a little structure within your lungs. It's at the very tip of all of the edges, like where that bronchi gets large or gets smaller and smaller and smaller into smaller branches. The alveoli are on the end of all those little bitty bronchioles, all those little branches, and they look kind of like a cluster of grapes. Now, if you'll remember from when we talked about tissue, alveoli are made of squamous, like they would be simple squamous epithelial tissue, okay? Very, very thin, one layer, okay, very, very thin because we need the gas exchange. So look down on the page on 307. I'm sorry, on this picture on the PowerPoint, but now alveoli is where gas exchange occurs, okay, and that's important. That's where the actual exchange of gas occurs. Oxygen leaves the outside air and goes into the body, and carbon dioxide leaves the blood from the body and goes into the outside air. But look at how each little alveoli is wrapped. Okay, everybody see how it's kind of wrapped like spider webs at the bottom of 307. So it's wrapped up. And if you'll notice, blood changes from red to blue. And what that's supposed to depict in your book is, I'm sorry, changes from blue to red. I said that backwards. So what that's supposed to mean within your book is the blood goes from being deoxygenated to being oxygenated. Okay, that's where that change occurs. So look how it did this close up on this alveolar sac. You can kind of see those squamous cells in there. And look how thin the area is. And it's just completely wrapped up in capillaries. And that way, it's very, very easy for gas exchange to occur. So look even at the next picture down at the bottom of 307 on the right-hand side. You know, there's just very, very, very thin membrane for oxygen and carbon dioxide to pass through. So they are just perfectly structured for that to happen. Now, a couple other things about alveoli. They have inside of them, they have what's called surfactant. And surfactant actually is like a little coating, kind of a watery coating inside of the alveoli. And one of the things that surfactant does is it actually helps keep the alveoli from collapsing. Okay, it helps to keep it open. That's, if you've ever heard of, you've heard people talk about babies being born premature and they have to have a shot to mature their lungs. This is one of the things that babies need in order for their lungs to function the way that they need to. Sometimes they'll give them a shot, or the mom, something that has the surfactant in it so that they can create that. The other thing that you'll find inside the alveoli is macrophages. And remember, a macrophage, it's been a while since we talked about that too, but a macrophage is a white blood cell, and it just engulfs things, okay? It engulfs foreign particles, bacteria, so all of that is also working in the respiratory system. So there's lots of measures that are taken for our respiratory system from our nose down to the alveoli that are taken in order to get rid of bacteria and other things that we find in the air. Okay, the pores of Kohn, these are the openings in the wall of the alveoli, whenever it says that term on there. Gas exchange, the alveolar capillary membrane down here, it's written at the bottom. This is just talking about that little bitty thin membrane between the alveoli and the capillary, very, very thin, so the gas exchange can occur really fast. So it does. It occurs very, very fast. I mean, within, the blink of an eye, exchange has occurred and air is moving. So a few things that this helps with. One, there's like a huge amount of surface area in your lungs. Okay, and that helps to increase gas exchange because that offers more space for things to cross over back and forth. They say that if you were to lay out your lungs, if you were to lay out all the alveoli in your lungs, okay, flatten them out, even though they're only 1 cell thick, flatten them out, it would cover almost a whole tennis court. That's how much surface area you have in your lungs.
We'll just out your trash, honey.
Okay, can y'all come back in just a few minutes? I'm recording lecture. It's okay. It's okay. Give me just a minute. Thank you. No, don't worry. Where was I? Okay, number 2. Again, the membrane is really, really thin, so it doesn't take long for it to travel. And then number 3, diffusion works. If you guys remember when we talked about the chemistry chapter, we have diffusion, and it generally moves, simple diffusion, occurs from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And it works that way even within the lungs. So our blood, by the time it gets back to the lungs, it's kind of depleted in oxygen. So it's got less oxygen than the air, than atmospheric air has. And so oxygen just easily diffuses into the bloodstream because it's going to an area of lower concentration. The same idea is true with carbon dioxide. So within the blood, we have a high amount of carbon dioxide whenever it comes back to the lungs because of the waste. Remember, carbon dioxide is a waste product of glucose and of all of that being used up, of respiration within the cell. So we get carbon dioxide left over. Well, carbon dioxide then leaves because carbon dioxide in the blood is a higher concentration than what is in the air. So that has to occur. So that diffusion occurs simply. That's another reason that gas exchanges so fast. Okay, it's pretty cool. Okay, the last little section here, the anatomy of the respiratory system. So we have the lungs. And you can turn over to 308, and there's a good picture there of the lungs. Okay, so the lungs themselves. Now, when we get out the pig lungs, and I'll do that. Y'all will please help me remember. We'll do that tomorrow. We'll do that on Thursday. They're really squishy. They don't weigh very much. Okay, they're they're kind of spongy feeling. So that's their consistency. Now the mediastinum, okay, media middle, this is actually the area kind of between the lungs. Okay, so you'll hear it's a cavity. We can call it a cavity, kind of like your thoracic cavity. Okay, the mediastinum is a cavity within that, and it contains the heart and the major blood vessels. It contains the trachea. So all of this actually, esophagus, all of this is kind of wrapped inside of the lungs, if you will, and that's all the mediastinum, whenever you see that word. Okay, the apex is the upper portion of the lungs, kind of like the pointy area. You can see how it's pointed to at the top on page 308. Okay, and then we have the pleural sac, which is or pleura. It's not always called the pleural sac. Sometimes it's called the pleura. Okay, the pleura is a double lined. It's a double lining that wraps around the lungs. So one set of the lining. Okay, the parietal lining is on the outside. It's actually on the inside of the rib cage, if you will, the thoracic wall. Okay, that's lined by the parietal, and the visceral pleura is actually lined right on the lungs. It's like right around the lungs. Okay, the lining that covers outside of that. Now, those two linings actually work together, okay, to provide a couple of things. One is they provide a lubrication. There is a fluid, this pleural fluid that is secreted between those two things. And so what happens is as the lungs, they're able to expand, get bigger and smaller, bigger and smaller. And that fluid between those two membranes actually serves as a lubricant so that the lungs can move freely and not rub, okay, not cause pain or friction or irritability, inflammation. The other thing that this does is it actually works, they're kind of like, it's kind of like they're glued together. The fluid between them kind of has this suction. If you've ever, if you guys have ever had like a Coke can or something on the table and that had it had condensation and condensation got underneath the cup, and when you pull it, it kind of has suction to it. It kind of has that because it had that fluid. Okay, it's the same idea with how these double lining pleura works. Okay, so your diaphragm is a muscle. It's down at the bottom of your lungs. Okay, whenever it contracts, it actually contracts this way. And what that does is that diaphragm then pulls on that parietal pleura. Okay, and it also, the parietal pleura is stuck to that visceral pleura, which is wrapped around the lungs, and it just opens up the lungs. Okay, the lungs don't do any of the muscle work themselves. They only do what other muscles do. So you've got your costal muscles, okay, as well, and those muscles contract and expand. Okay, they contract to open up the rib cage. The diaphragm contracts, opens up from underneath, and it just basically pulls the lungs open. And when it does that, it provides this kind of negative pressure, so the air is brought in. And we'll talk about that more in detail Thursday. But anyways, I just wanted to give you guys an idea of why those two linings are important and how they work together. Remember again that the right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has 2 lobes. And a lot of that is just the left lung has to make room for the heart. There's more of the heart that's on the left side. So it has to make extra room for the heart to sit right there. Okay, now the diaphragm is a muscle, so know that as well. Other than that, I think that's it. So yeah, that's great. We will talk about how breathing actually works, okay, on Thursday, and then Friday you guys will get to do a lab. We'll talk about diseases next week.